Now let's talk about the Constitution itself. First thing I want to talk about is the timing of the Constitution, and that relates to what we were just talking about with Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion, the attempt to close the court in Springfield, Massachusetts, is in August of 1786. The Annapolis Convention, that's the meeting about federal regulation of state commerce, that's September of 1786. The attack on the Springfield Armory is February 1787, the following winter, and the Constitutional Convention's May of 1787. So Shays' Rebellion and the lead up to the Constitutional Convention happened at the same time, and that's why I think Shays' Rebellion is so much on the minds of the men who write the Constitution. To quote Madison again, liberty may be endangered by the abuses of liberty as well as by the abuses of power. So the Constitution is written and debated in a context where the people doing that writing and debating are very concerned with what they see as the abuses of liberty and uprisings of the poor and Hicks, the rural farmers. And that is in part related in or reflected in who writes the Constitution. The Constitutional Convention has 55 delegates. Of those 55, 30 are college educated. That's an enormous proportion in that society. 2 of them become president, Washington and Madison. 2 become chief justice. 6 become governors. And 3/4 of them serve in Congress. They're much more educated, they're far more wealthier, and they're far more politically important than the average person. Hamilton says this, all communities divide themselves into the few and the many. The first are the rich and well-born, the others the mass of the people. And the Constitutional Convention reflects that division very, very clearly. Okay, what do they do? Well, they set up a government, the federal government, that I believe is an attempt to control the democratic impulses that are apparent in things like Shays' Rebellion. And the first way they attempt to do that is through the theory of successive filtration. They are attempting to create an elite government. The president is not directly elected. He's elected by the Electoral College. The United States Senate is not directly elected. It is today, but at the time, senators were elected by state legislatures. In other words, we have an elite group choose an even more elite group. Federal judges get, as they have today, life terms in office. They are attempting to create a system in which elites have power, and they largely succeed. Another example, the House of Representatives is rather small. There are 65 members of the House of Representatives. That means that they have large districts. They're doing that deliberately so that important and wealthy men, who are the only ones well known enough to get elected in a large district, get elected. In comparison, for example, the Massachusetts Assembly had over 200 members. So for your state government, you have small districts, you know your representatives, it's much more democratic, but we're trying to create a House of Representatives that's very elite. I mean, there are still only 435 members of the House of Representatives for a nation of 300 million people. So the Constitutional Convention meets from May to September of 1787, and they are a bunch of elite characters. There's Benjamin Franklin right in the middle. They elect George Washington, president of the Constitutional Convention, by the way. And they've got concerns about what they see as the social instability of the 1780s, and they're working to resolve that. They are worried about governing a country the sheer size of the United States. They're worried about a balance between state and federal powers. They're worried about retaining the respect of foreign countries. But most of all, I believe, they're worried about the stability of the United States. Okay, what are some of the compromises they make? Well, one of them is the famous compromise between big states and small states, that the House of Representatives is elected by population, but the Senate is going to have 2 members apiece. Another is the famous 3/5 clause in the Constitution that counts slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation. And that's the idea that states with slave populations are going to get more representation because of the slaves. But because slaves are not voters and not citizens, they're not going to count fully. So this is kind of absurd idea that slaves are going to count as 3/5 of a person. And here is the aggregate total of voters in the state of New York. New York was a slave state and had a significant number of slaves. And you can see that the middle column here is the number of the 3/5 of the total number of slaves in each ward in the city of New York. So there's a significant number of slaves in New York City, and then that's added to the population of free persons for a total. That goes on anywhere there are slaves, and it's one of the compromises of the Constitution. Okay, when the work of the Constitutional Convention is done, there is a mechanism for it to be ratified. It goes to the state governments for ratification. And that is the time in which the opponents of the Constitution rise up and begin to question it. And the Constitution is presented as a yay or nay. There's no modification of it. It's presented as a yay or nay to each state. And the people in each state begin to debate about whether they should create this much stronger federal government. And the opponents of the Constitution become known as anti-federalists. And they make some very strong arguments against it. The most famous anti-federalist is Patrick Henry, and I'm not going to read to you some of Patrick Henry's arguments against the passage of the Constitution. He wrote, "Here is a revolution as radical as that which separated us from Great Britain. It is radical in this transition. Our rights and privileges are endangered, and the sovereignty of the states will be relinquished. And cannot we plainly see that this is actually the case? The rights of conscience, trial by jury, liberty of the press, all your immunities and franchises, all pretensions to human rights and privileges are being rendered insecure, if not lost, by this change so loudly talked of by some and inconsiderately by others. Is this tame relinquishment of rights worthy of freemen? Is it worthy of that manly fortitude that ought to characterize Republicans? Is it necessary for your liberty that you should abandon those great rights by the adoption of this system? Will the abandonment of your most sacred rights tend to the security of your liberty? Liberty, the greatest of all earthly blessings. Give us that precious jewel, and you may take everything else. The Confederation, the same despised government, merits, in my opinion, the highest encomium. It carries us through a long and dangerous war. It rendered us victorious in that bloody conflict with a powerful nation. It has secured us the territory greater than any European monarch professes. And shall a government which has been thus strong and vigorous be accused of imbecility and abandoned for want of energy? Consider what you are about to do before you part with your government. We are cautioned by the honorable gentleman who presides against faction and turbulence. I acknowledge also the new form of government may effectually prevent it. Yet there's another thing it will as effectually do. It will oppress and ruin the people. The Constitution is said to have beautiful features, but when I come to examine these features, sir, they appear to me to be horribly frightful. Among other deformities, it is an awful squinting. It squints toward monarchy. And does this not raise indignation in the breast of every true American? Your president may easily become king. Your senate is so imperfectly constructed that your dearest rights may be sacrificed by what may be a small minority. And a very small minority may continue forever unchangeably this government, although horribly defective. Where are your checks in this government? Your strong handholds will be in the hands of your enemies. And so forth. Some of these objections of the Anti-Federalists, that there's no freedom of the press guaranteed, that trial by jury, liberty of the press, freedom of conscience, right to worship, these things are not guaranteed in the Constitution. These arguments are so effective that it leads to the adoption of the first 10 amendments as a response to these objections. The Anti-Federalists are worried above all about liberty. They think the creation of the stronger Constitution is in fact anti-republican and anti-democratic. And there's a good argument for that. There's a good argument for saying that the Anti-Federalists are right in these objections. But they lose. The Constitution's ratified. There's Madison, who was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, the arguments for passage of the Constitution, later becomes President of the United States. And here's the ratified to vote the votes to ratify the Constitution state by state. And you can see here that the blue areas are coastal for the most part, and the Anti-Federalists are the areas that are the backcountry. It's the people of the backcountry, the people who are part of these rural rebellions, that are the ones who are most opposed to the Constitution. Take a close look at New England, coastal Massachusetts, the Connecticut River Valley, and the coast of Connecticut and Rhode Island are the areas in which the Constitution is supported most strongly, and it's the more rural, isolated areas that are against it. And that's what I mean when I say that the Constitution is kind of revolt by the coastal elites against the fear of uprising from the backcountry. Look at New York, it's even more striking. The city and Long Island are solidly in favor of it, and upstate is against it. So the coastal elites win in the passage of the Constitution, and they win one more time, and that's the thing I want to end with now, the Whiskey Rebellion. In 1793, there's a federal tax on whiskey. And what this tax is in effect a tax on agriculture. It's a tax, most effectively, a tax on corn, because corn is the raw material for whiskey that's produced in the United States. It's corn whiskey. And this, what changing your corn into whiskey does two things. One, it makes it much more portable. Really, three things. It makes it much more portable. It prevents it from rotting. If you leave corn in a barn, it's going to rot. Rats are going to eat it, and so forth. Whiskey's going to preserve. You can preserve indefinitely. And it's also a value-added product. So it's very, very common for rural farmers to distill whiskey. And a tax on whiskey is therefore a tax on rural farmers. You don't pay it if you're a storekeeper in a city. You pay it if you're a farmer who makes whiskey. So the revolt against this tax, which becomes known as the Whiskey Rebellion, is another rural revolt against the federal government. It's a challenge to the Constitution. Now, the Whiskey Rebellion doesn't come to anything because George Washington puts on his uniform one last time as President of the United States, in this case, and leads an army into Pennsylvania, where the heart of the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Whiskey Rebellion, you can't even say it's defeated, it evaporates. Nobody wants to challenge George Washington. So he uses his great prestige one last time to support the federal government, and he's president. But the Whiskey Rebellion shows us that these rural attitudes of the fear of oppression by coastal elites, the suspicion of government, they don't go away, and arguably they haven't gone away yet. That the plain folks in the backcountry still don't like the elite, and they still are suspicious of the federal government, and in a way, none of that's changed.